what's up? It's Brooks. Hope you're having a good day, good week, good weekend. We're back with another installment of our weekly, yet unnamed weekend critique series. Remember that these critiques are for supporters over on patreon.com/bageldenizen at the Novice Bard tier. If you want one of your own, remember that it's completely optional that the critique be shared publicly like these here today. These folks have just opted in for theirs to be shared publicly. This week we have both Bobbert and Miranda. Bobbert has a little bit of work to do as far as his value structure and something that we call same face syndrome that you might recognize across certain artists' work. Miranda has a few things to work on as far as her representation side of her drawing versus her conceptual drawing, and an over-reliance, at least at the point that this critique was done, on ink in her work. So hopefully you enjoy these. Remember that they're intended specifically for these people, but there's always something that we can learn by looking at someone else's work. Hey there, Bobbert. How's it going? Thanks for being a patron. So I've got a little bit of your work pulled together here, and from the form you're talking about a couple of things that you'd like to be working on, mainly that most of your work has been just some standalone characters who are literally standing alone, right? They're not part of any scenery, not really doing much, not much as far as storytelling and things like that. And that you'd also like to be working toward things like graphic novels or comics or things where these characters are interacting with other things. So a couple of things that I have in mind for you. Mostly these are things that jumped out to me with your work and are maybe symptoms of or signs that point to what you could be doing to improve. So the first character I picked out here was your Chiss mechanic here. One of the main reasons I did that is because I'm a big Grand Admiral Thrawn fan, so that's pretty cool. You've got a Chiss character here. So here's the thing. First of all, that I wanted to point out with these examples over here, you see I've got something kind of hidden away up top there. With this character and these here, I want to show you what happens when I add a layer that completely gets rid of the color and hue and just shows you the value of your colors. So before I do that, the thing that I'd like you to be working on is getting more vibrant and more distinct with your, with your color choices. So here's what happens when I turn this on. You notice how this character here, which I think is maybe one of your stronger ones, so you lose some of the color, right? You lose some of the difference between those two colors, and that's fine because they're very drastically different hues. But then you do still get like a nice distinction from the hair and hands and the rest of the body. And again, here with the hand. So to me, that's, from a design standpoint, that reads very well, okay? Let's go ahead and turn this back off. And you see how even with a character that's got a lot of hues, right? Like this is a rainbow color scheme. But what's strange, or what might initially seem strange, is that it doesn't appear to be rainbow colored, right? It doesn't look vibrant, and nothing is necessarily standing out. Because not only are you using desaturated hues, desaturated colors for the most part, see with things like, not so much with the two ladies over here, but with these here, you've got kind of a dark gray, a very muted red, like a red that almost reads as a light brown in some circumstances, same here, and then a gray for the face, and then a still fairly muted color for the eye, except for when we get to those really light parts, but because they're kind of blending together, you get about there. So turning it back on, you see how the feathers don't really change, right? They're, you just have the wing and a few strokes of color. And apart from the fact that they aren't really following any necessary feather guidelines, right? Like you have some feathers that are drawn out here, like this, but your colors aren't going red feather. And I understand, you know, this is a quick study and stuff. It's not all supposed to be like this, but this would kind of, you'd start to get somewhere with something like that. So with both a change in value, so value is the lightness and darkness of a color, right? Devoid of, you know, you can do things on grayscale. Value has to do with the grayscale of the color, if that makes sense. But you know, this is a dark value that's low saturation. Let me go to this classic. This is more, I think you're using Photoshop, so this will be more relevant to you. Okay, down here, dark value. Up here, light value. Right here, here is like a neutral value, right? So not necessarily vibrant or contrasting at all, okay, in this mid-gray. Left to right here is saturation. So this is a low saturation purple, right? There's almost no purple in it, and this is a high saturation. So your color choices tend to stay not only in this neutral zone of saturation, or rather a value, but also not really leaving the vibrance, right? Like they aren't saturating too much. And so having a character, or, you know, whatever your subject is, that is made up of 80% these colors is actually like a good choice, right? If I come here, it's not necessarily the way that I tend to color my things myself, but everyone's a little bit different. So if I had, let's just do a random, I don't know what this is. Maybe it's a movie camera. I did that in a recent critique too. Okay, great. So now I've got my video camera, and there's, you know, the reels up here. These are all fairly similarly, you know, that color doesn't even, you can't see against these two, so I'll take it away. But I'll go up a little bit, right? And maybe in there some film reels or something like that. I'm not really caring too much about how this looks, but just the overall palette. But now if I was to add to this, you know, keeping the colors in this 80% range, now I come up to the sort of other 20% that I am using in the proportion of my image, and I come up to about here, right, with this more saturated purple, and it can be a little bit lighter in value, can be a little bit darker, not a big deal. But now whatever I use here, and if I hue shift a little bit toward maybe like a blue, although it's even better if I can get like on the opposite end of the color wheel, right? So if we've been over here in this range, if we go over to here, up here, this is really gonna stand out, right? Maybe a little bit golder, about there. So now wherever I add this, our eye is going to be immediately drawn to that. But this is a good balance. Otherwise, I think if you've got something, you know, this video camera is nonsense, but if you have something like a character here, well, why not draw some attention to the eyes? I'll go back to red pen so I'm not confusing you with I'm not talking about a color choice, just what should be vibrant. If these eyes were, even if it was that red, you know, something that stands out. If the mask was kind of peeling away from, you know, if the feathers were a neutral or light value, if these feathers here and all over the body were, you know, preferably neutral, because you want the end of the wings here and the face to stand out, then I would go with a light or dark value, right? Anything that's either, you know, light or dark, not neutral, when everything else is sort of in this neutral range. Doesn't really matter which way you go with it. Okay, and some of that can be up to sort of your personal preference and style. Okay, and if we go over to your Chiss girl here, I don't even need to go grayscale with her, but you see a general amount of sameness in the values here. And that's mainly because of the blue. It's blue on blue, which is a little bit difficult. If you look at Grand Admiral Thrawn, as he's used in the, you know, official Star Wars art, he's got the white outfit, the white Grand Admiral uniform, and the gold trim and gold pauldrons and metals and things that all go nicely with the blue, kind of the way that you've got this gold here, but it stands out a bit more because it's not the same as this skin tone, okay? So moving on from color, I would say that most of your characters tend to look this way, right? They tend to be posed in this straight up and down and facing the camera away. The sameness is something that I would warn against breaking out of. When it comes to faces, here's sort of the final part of the things that I put together. If you'll notice how similar all of these faces look, you know, if we took these two over here, these two faces, and flipped them, you know, we'd get pretty much the same. I just wanted to not flip it off of the critique video because these were technically facing the other direction. But if we put them all together like this, there's a lot of similarity in eye shape, in angle that you're looking at this from, and from the shape of the jaw and everything, even though these are all very different characters, or they should be. What this tends to be, or where I notice this the most, is when you're drawing the same thing over and over again, or drawing the same way, it is a sign of comfort, right? The same face syndrome, as it's sometimes called, I think is not leaving your comfort zone enough, finding something that works a certain amount and not pushing yourself to expand, to learn more, to try and understand something like the face more, and look for diversity in what can look good from people that look different ways, right? Different weights and ethnic backgrounds and size of facial features and things like that, and ages. So I would advise you to do some studies and do them at different angles, and don't really worry about the fact that when you start sort of from scratch, if because you're not going with these same angles, if you start now by looking at the face almost from the top down like this, right? If sort of the eyes are here, the nose and mouth, or if you less drastically are just looking at the face straight on and messing with facial features and things that you are trying out and changing the shapes and proportions of, recognizing that it's not going to look as good as what you've been doing, or it's not going to feel as comfortable, and pushing past that, because as an artist, you're going to need to continue to grow as much as you can. And variance in shape, I think, is one of the main things that I'd like to see you work with more. Obviously, you see the results with something like this character over here. You're happy with, because you're kind of messing with shapes, and that's proportion of body and body shapes and sizes is going to help you. I'm seeing a lot of both male and female characters that are, basically this same set of proportions. So if it takes life drawing, if it takes almost going kind of zany and cartoony as much as, doing that kind of study, as much as you're doing life and realism practice, I think it's going to help you to kind of break out of the mold that you're in. Because the thing that happens with comics is that's such a gauntlet. We want to be able to tell stories, but the thing about that is that you need to be able to draw characters from every angle. You need to be able to draw those backgrounds and things like that. And that's all pretty daunting at the point you're at right now. But if you start with those skills of building those skills of posing and drawing characters from different angles, other things start to get a little bit easier as you kind of build one step at a time. So it's not a rush. That's a lot of information, and just take things one step at a time. You're going to do great. Thank you so much. Hope this is helpful for you, and have fun creating, like I always say. Hey Miranda, how's it going? Thank you so much for being a patron, and thanks for being willing to have this critique done. I've collected a couple of examples of your work here from your Instagram. It's really cool stuff. I'll tell you some of the things that I like. I like your attention to detail. I like that you have sort of this more traditional and realist approach to certain things, which makes things like this this face here is really nice. There's a couple of other examples where you've had let me see, I'm back on the page. There's a couple of posts from the range. It's actually a lot older, April 18th, 2017 through the 21st. There's a couple of ladies who look somewhat similar to this one, or at least the three of them look fairly similar. And I like things. I like this Crichton here. It's got a nice amount of appeal and things. And so you're on a good track. I noticed in your form for the critique, you mentioned that long term you're working on a comic and you're looking to get more consistency in your artwork. And so I wanted to sort of let you know what I see as far as what's kind of causing the issue with consistency, or my hypothesis really of where you're at and where you'd like to be. So a couple of things that I see you doing. First is your muscle that's stronger. The thing that you've worked more on, which is not a bad thing in the slightest, is this. I say realistic, even though a lot of these things are stylized. It's a skew from realism, right? It's an approach that is representational in drawing and not conceptual, if that makes sense. So what you've done, what it looks like is you're creating things that are imaginary, right? But you're doing so as though you were representing something like a still life or a portrait in front of you. Not necessarily a bad thing, but here's what I sort of mean by that. With realism, there's the idea, and even if you're saying, oh, I never did that, I didn't take classes for that, or things like that. What I mean by it is the sort of the way that you've learned, intentionally or not, taught or not, taught by someone else or self-taught, is to kind of represent things as light and dark planes, right? And a lot of times this involves what is essentially a very flat image, right? The same way that a photograph is a flat image. You're taking things and measuring them out and, sort of building on them as though they were flat shapes. This Animal Crossing character down here is a good representation of that, or a good signifier of this. What I see here is a very flat character, right? Each of the shapes it's comprising don't really have any contours to them. Even the stripes here that would be sort of wrapping just a certain amount are coming across pretty flat, right? The character is sort of floating there, not necessarily standing on the ground. And so here's my idea of here's what that basically means. Is it just means you have to build up the conceptual side of things, right? So what I'd like to see you doing most, like soonest first, is building up a collection or doing a set of exercises with spheres and cylinders. So let me crank this up a little bit. I'd like to see you just building out spheres, right? And the reason for this is the contours, right? You want to get the form and the shape, not just one or the other. So when you build out these spheres and cylinders, I then want you to take something that's otherwise flat, right? Like a logo is kind of rough, but maybe a set of eyes or a symbol or a shape, right? And draw it flat out top. Draw it flat off to the side here like this, and then try like adding it to your now round objects, right? And you want to kind of make that curve realistic. And the reason for this is that you kind of want to build up a conceptual your conceptual side, a conceptual language of things. You want to create things that are not necessarily real things like stylized characters and things, the poses, the locations, everything in your comic, unless you're actually adapting them from a photograph, is going to be things that you're laying out mentally. So it's going to be a good idea to get a better understanding of 3D space as you move forward. And another thing that I'm noticing too is a reliance that you have on ink, or just a tendency toward using ink. And the thing about ink, at least when I see it, looking through your work, there isn't a lot of situations where you started with pencil, right, and then erased away after you've added ink. It's more so I'm seeing starting with ink, right? And what happens there, and this kind of goes back to this realism idea, and hopefully all these ideas kind of connect for you, is that it's almost like starting, say I want to do a face, and so I start with an eye here, and then I come over, and the nose is next, and say I want to add a forehead now, and I just remember there's a cool hairstyle that I'd like to, I'm not saying it's this scatterbrained, right, but it's starting at one point, it's kind of point A to point B, and I'm doing this, and sometimes it's things that I have done before, and so there's a mental library that's telling me about these things, but I'm kind of doing this, right? Whereas what would have been better for me to do, unless I've drawn this character over and over and over again to a point where I can just kind of lay these final lines down immediately, that's far off down the line. That's, 20 or 30 issues of your comic deep, right? What I should have done was understood the construction of the head first and laid down and where the jaw goes and where the skull is, right? And then started saying, okay, well, here's a line that represents the bottom of the eyes, and I lay my eyes on top of there, and I make sure that the eyes are the same height, but I wrap the eyes around the sphere like this, right? So now this eye is actually shorter than, or not shorter, it's thinner, right? It's coming in this direction more so than the one that we're seeing more. And that's something that I'm sure you have an understanding of and everything so far, or have already. But that's kind of the direction that you should be going. And from there, things like drawing full bodies a little bit more would be good, and getting the placement of these characters in space and the weight to them would be helpful too. Just adding that ground plane is helpful, right? And working things out in 3 dimensions. I think the thing that's hamstringing you a bit right now is the sort of flatness of things, right? And when you're making comics, in order to tell the story effectively, you have to be able to represent everything out there, right? Even if it's just really simple, you need the buildings and the characters standing together and things like that, unless you really want, full on just flat characters standing next to each other talking. So hopefully those things kind of made sense. The idea of skewing less from representational, which is still good. There's nothing wrong with learning how to draw things realistically or learning in that method. But if you're trying to lean toward more, visual storytelling, stylized art, the way that, it's used in the animation industry, comics, games, stuff like that, that's what I would recommend for you moving forward. So looking forward to seeing where you go from here. Definitely have a lot already that's going well with you, and I hope to see you progress. Thanks a lot.